Well, tonight I'll be talking about, of course, Studebaker of Canada. As many people know, the Canadian operation was had a long distinguished career in Studebaker history, and this was actually where the final Studebakers were made in the mid-1960s. But to properly set the table for what we're going to talk about tonight, we need to go back a little bit further in Studebaker history. And before we get going here, I was just asked to point out where the Studebaker National Museum actually is. You can see highlighted there. We are in South Bend, Indiana. South Bend is named for the south bend of the St. Joseph River, which runs west to east, or east to west across northern Indiana, and the birthplace of Studebaker and home to many fine things, including the University of Notre Dame, Studebaker National Museum, and some other fine tourist destinations. Also kind of in the nexus of a bunch of wonderful car museums, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway Museum, the Auburn Duesenberg Museum over in Auburn, Indiana, not that far also, of course, from the Henry Ford Museum up in Detroit, as well as the Gilmore Collection up near Kalamazoo, Michigan. So if you're looking to make an automotive road trip, take a week, come down and see us, and we promise you a rip snorting good time. We're going to go back and start, as I mentioned, a few decades before Studebaker made its cars and vehicles in Canada. We're with the Studebaker brothers. The company began as a two-man blacksmith shop in February of 1852. Actually, February 16th, today is the anniversary of the Studebaker brothers founding. I believe we're talking about 170 or so years of Studebaker history here. But yes, today is the very day. Henry and Clem Studebaker opened a blacksmith shop in downtown South Bend. They had learned the carriage and wagon making trade from their father, in addition to being very accomplished blacksmiths. Their first year in business, actually, the first day of business, the Studebaker brothers shod one horse. The day's receipts tallied 25 cents. Eventually, word got around that the Studebaker brothers were pretty decent blacksmiths and could also make a pretty fair wagon. We see this artist rendition of what their early shop looked like. And I should say this is a very, shall we say, optimized version, I'm sure, of what the shop appeared. You cannot, I can assure you the streets of South Bend were not this clean, and I can't imagine there was a well-maintained sidewalk sitting out in front of the shop, but this is a pretty good representation of what the facilities the brothers were working with. The company was initially known as H&C for Henry and Clem Studebaker, then it became C&J.M. Studebaker when J.M. Studebaker, one of the younger brothers, joined the firm. Eventually, all five brothers were involved with the company, and they stopped ordering new letterhead and just finally said, we're going to call it the Studebaker Brothers Manufacturing Company, and that's what it was known from the late 1860s up until the early teens. The Studebaker brothers grew rapidly. They were blessed with, each of the brothers really had a skill that lent itself well to the company. Clem and Henry and John were excellent wagon makers. Peter Studebaker, one of the other brothers, was a skilled salesman. And he kind of gets the short shrift in Studebaker history, as he was the one who I think had a lot to do with the company's success, because he went out and sold all the product. He set up a store in St. Joseph, Missouri, which then was a jumping off point for settlers heading west. And you do your best business on Main Street, and right on Main Street in St. Joseph, Missouri was one of the first Studebaker outlets. You see this price list from 1877 from an outlet in Lafayette, Indiana. Studebaker had grown very rapidly during the 1870s and into the 1880s. So by this time, they were proclaiming themselves the world's largest. And I love this advertisement that they put out there. The sun always shines on the Studebaker wagon, more than 1 million Studebaker vehicles in daily use the world over. And indeed, this was no empty claim. Studebaker was exporting vehicles as early as 1881. They were a national brand across the United States, as well as other areas across the globe. We see now their plant has grown from the two-man blacksmith shop, and they're proud to proclaim immediately covers adjacent 20 acres, as well as their lumberyard, including the lumberyard's 80 acres in all. And lest we think the Studebakers were just down here in the United States, they also were doing big business in Canada. And this is one of Studebaker's, I think, marketing brilliances. They would create models for specific markets. We have catalogs for Utah wagons, for Georgia wagons, and even, lest they think, the Canadian market they were thinking of wagons just for people north of the border in Canada, and they would have specific models as they determined would work well in the particular needs of the country and climate. By the turn of the century, Studebaker Brothers Manufacturing Company, they're proclaiming themselves the world's largest. This particular advertisement proclaims 125,000 vehicles every year. Now, this is a pretty impressive sum in the pre-assembly line era, especially when there were many years in the automobile era where Studebaker did not top 125,000 vehicles. So note in the other corner, largest vehicle manufacturer in the world, and say plant covers 101 acres. And this footprint, this was pretty much Studebaker's South Bend footprint here. They would eventually evolve the horse-drawn works into the automobile era. And this is where the last Studebakers in Indiana were made, in some of these buildings you see here. But then there's this thing called the automobile coming to market. And put yourself in the Studebaker brothers' position. Around the late 19th century, you're hearing rumblings about the self-propelled vehicle, but you've been in business for nearly 50 years as the world's largest horse-drawn vehicle manufacturer. You aren't really going to abandon that business right out of the gate just to jump into automobiles. In fact, the Studebakers had investigated bicycles about a decade earlier. There was a huge bicycle craze in the early 1890s, and more than one person approached the Studebaker brothers about getting into this business. They wisely saw that the bicycle craze was just that, a fad. Eventually it went away, and there were many bankrupt bicycle manufacturers left in its wake. They weren't entirely sure that the automobile was not going to be the same thing, yet its popularity was growing rapidly, and they felt it was certainly something worth looking into. So what Studebaker did is essentially entered into a marketing arrangement with several upstart vehicle manufacturers to sell their vehicles through Studebaker's vast dealer network. Studebaker's first automobile came along in 1902. It was an electric. Gasoline-powered cars would not come along until 1904. John M. Studebaker much preferred the electric automobiles to the gasoline-powered cars. He proclaimed gasoline cars as clumsy, dangerous, noisy brutes which stink to high heaven and break down at the worst possible moment. It took some convincing for him to realize, till he was satisfied that the gasoline-powered car could live up to what he expected from the automobiles. But Studebaker from 1904 to 1911 were producing gasoline-powered cars, or selling gasoline-powered cars and electric automobiles side by side, in addition to their burgeoning horse-drawn vehicle business. Theoretically, you could walk into a Studebaker dealer, decide if you wanted a horse-drawn vehicle, an electric automobile, or a gasoline-powered automobile. The companies Studebaker partnered with, early on, you had the General and Garford companies, but later they had their most success partnering with the Everett Metzger Flanders Company of Detroit, Michigan. And that's what the EMF stands for, the three principals, Everett, Metzger, and Flanders. It was a bit of a complicated and convoluted business arrangement there for a couple of years, but essentially Studebaker acquired distribution rights for the EMF company's output. Studebaker was satisfied with that the automobile business was here to stay, where they went off to acquire EMF in its entirety. This took some financial maneuvering, but when the dust all settled, you had Studebaker, now named the Studebaker Corporation, no longer the Studebaker Brothers Manufacturing, but the Studebaker Corporation, producers of EMF and Flanders automobiles. And here's how Studebaker gets to Canada. The EMF company had started work on a plant in Walkerville, Ontario, about 1908-1909, and when the transaction was consummated, that plant became property of the Studebaker Corporation. So we see here, this is an illustration of the Studebaker Corporation of Canada Limited. If some of you are scratching your heads wondering just where the heck is Walkerville, well, it's actually now it's a neighborhood in Windsor, but at the time it was its own municipality. And we see here, just to the south of Detroit there, you see where it's actually the Cascades, looked like a bedding company was in that space now, but that's right where the Studebaker plant was in the Walkerville neighborhood of Windsor. So the plant in Walkerville, pretty modest to get from the start here, but we should clarify exactly what we're talking about by a plant. They were not pouring cylinder blocks or having huge presses. There was really much more of an assembly and finishing plant. And you can see the detail on the right hand of the screen from the insurance maps. Whoops, sorry about that. Detailing everything that went on in the plant: chassis painting, assembling, and they actually did some road testing, to make sure that the finished vehicles were suitable for market. But the raw materials and raw parts came in steadily from Studebaker's plants in the United States. And just a word on Studebaker's situation in the teens here. The South Bend plant was still producing horse-drawn equipment. Very little by way of automobile production took place in South Bend, Indiana, under the Studebaker name until the 1920s. Studebaker's primary automobile outlets were in Detroit, and that came along with the EMF and Flanders plants in Detroit. And they had two major operations. One of the facilities was down on Jefferson Avenue, down near the river, and another parts were over on Paquette Avenue, and part of that plant still remains to this very day. Studebaker was growing rapidly in the teens as people really had the trust in the Studebaker name, and it was something the Studebaker was able to parlay into automobile sales. They soon dispensed with the EMF and the Flanders name, and the cars were branded as Studebakers. But Studebaker was looking to really expand in a big way, and having the Canadian plant, of course, had its advantages for distributing cars through, of course, to the Canadian market, but also the British markets duty-free. But Studebaker was also looking at a massive overhaul of its South Bend plant, and that was to produce the new Studebaker Light 6. The Light 6 was going to be Studebaker's entry-level model, the popular price car, if you will. Now, they weren't going after the Model T price point. No one could really match that at that time, but Studebaker was looking to really broaden its markets. A massive overhaul took place at the South Bend plant as new factories were erected. This plant, the illustration you see here, is where the former lumber yards were, as Studebaker discontinued horse-drawn vehicle production in 1920 to accommodate the new automobile production. We see more plants going up here, just a tremendous flurry of activity in South Bend as the company was looking to eventually transition out of Detroit and concentrate automobile production in South Bend. And it wasn't just the South plant that was undergoing expansion. They invested resources in the Walkerville plant as well. You see the earlier plant on the left, but you see 4 new buildings were built at the Walkerville facility in the early 1920s, as they had hopes for even greater production taking place across the border. So how do you spy a Canadian-built Studebaker of this era? Well, they had their own radiator badge. You see here, this is on our 1927 president from the museum, proudly proclaims "Made in Canada." The Canadian cars also had their unique serial number designations. And you would also see maybe some other detailed differences between the US-built cars and the Canadian-built cars as well, depending on, at times, they might take advantage of local suppliers for certain components. As we get into the 1930s, however, there's this little thing called the Great Depression that hit in 1929, and Studebaker was certainly not immune to this financial reversal, but the company really kept managing its affairs as if the Depression was just going to go away very quickly. And unfortunately, by 1933, the company found itself in really dire financial straits, as they had been paying out dividends out of company capital to maintain Studebaker stock price. You know what happens when you pay dividends in a year where you show a loss? You lose a whole lot of money. In 1933, we see a 33 President St. Regis Brome here, Studebaker was actually paying out 506% of its profits in dividends. All the chickens came home to roost in March of 1933 when Studebaker was broke. They simply had no more money. They entered receivership, and the company's very existence was in question. They were able to emerge from receivership, but Studebaker was no longer really the same company, whereas they were in the early 30s, they were trying to be a mini General Motors. After receivership, they scaled down and really concentrated in the medium price field. As a result of some tariff changes in 1936, Studebaker actually found it was more economical to supply cars for all its markets from the South Bend plant, and the Walkerville, Ontario facility was shut down in 1936. If you're wondering is there anything left of the Walkerville plant today? Yes, there is. A couple of years ago, I happened to be up in Detroit, actually Dearborn, at the Henry Ford Museum's Motor Muster, and Curator of Transportation Matt Anderson and I decided to take a little road trip across the border to see what we could find of the Walkerville plant. We see many of the buildings actually are still there. In fact, on a percentage basis, the Walkerville Studebaker plant has the most surviving structures of any Studebaker production facility worldwide. And I believe this was the test facility we looked at earlier in the insurance map. And you can see a distinctive sawtooth roof. As soon as we saw that, Matt and I realized this is definitely the Studebaker plant we're looking for. I will say that this was one of our more adventurous outings we had, in particular because despite the Canadian border authorities being very happy to let me across into Canada with my American driver's license, the US authorities did not feel as generous on the way back, and it took some cajoling and talking and pleading before they decided to let me back into the country. After World War II, Studebaker saw need for perhaps resuming production in Canada. And as they saw a great buyer's market pent up, they were looking for some additional capacity. And with that, I would like to turn it over to my co-presenter tonight, Mr. Richard Barlas, to tell us about how Studebaker ended up in Hamilton, Ontario. Richard?
So, thank you very much. I am not by trade an automotive historian. I am an industrial historian. So one of the ways I wanted to look at this was basically why Hamilton? What was there in Hamilton that would have attracted a large corporation like Studebaker to build or buy, as they did, a large manufacturing concern in Hamilton? So I'm going to approach it from sort of that industrial historian's perspective. So first of all, where is Hamilton was part of the answer. Anybody from Canada will know this, but I don't know if we have people registered from the United States. Hamilton is at the head of Lake Ontario. You can see it right here. And it's also right in the middle of what is called the Golden Horseshoe, which is this horseshoe shape between Toronto and St. Catharines, Niagara Falls. And that is where, at the time, and to a large extent still, the bulk of Canada's manufacturing was. So all the money, all the industry was located in this place, in the Golden Horseshoe. And if you're going to build a plant and a heavy industry, you're going to do it here. This gives you a bit of a sense of Hamilton's transportation links at the time. So you've got the roads that were available at the time. You've got the railways, no lack of connectivity, either within within the country of Canada, or for that matter, to the United States. The QEW was in existence, for instance, at the time. I did a Google search for how far away, for instance, Hamilton was from the St. Catharines plant that made the engines towards the end of Studebaker's productions, and it tells me it's 32 minutes currently, and the border itself is less than an hour away. So really good connectivity with the infrastructure of North America. Hamilton also has a large natural harbor. It's one of the largest on the Great Lakes, and this allows for bulk products to be brought in and removed quite easily from Hamilton. So it's got a large port as well. For those who are curious, the Studebaker plant on this particular map is in sort of this area here. It also is the home of Hamilton's steel industry. And if you're going to make things out of steel like cars, that's a good place to be. So I did a little bit of forensic research into the business climate at the time. The total value of goods produced in Hamilton in 1948 was about $500 million. Of this, about 45% of it, or about $230 million, was linked to the steel or the transportation industry. So Hamilton very much was steel town at the time. In the 1950s, Stelco, one of the two big producers, produced approximately 3 million tons annually of steel, so no shortage. Dofasco, the other large producer, would have been slightly behind that, but not by a whole lot. And this was well known at the time to fuel steel-intensive businesses like car construction, but also roads, railways, bridges, that kind of thing. So it was very much an industrial concern. Hamilton was the third largest manufacturing center in Canada in 1948, behind only Montreal and Toronto. It had about 55,000 industrial workers out of a population of about 260,000, or about 1/4 of the population worked in industry in Hamilton. Over 80% of that working population worked for industries over 100 employees. So Hamilton was a large center for large industry. So if you're looking for a skilled workforce that knows how to build complex things like cars, Hamilton is the place to be. In fact, we had industries in all of these various areas. Every single one of the areas that the government was tracking at the time. There were even other vehicle manufacturers in Hamilton, including the Willis Overland Motor Company, the Beaver Truck Corporation, National Steel Car, which makes rail cars predominantly, did produce trucks, as did Sawyer Massey, which predominantly produced agricultural tools, did also make trucks. So there was already a vehicle manufacturing presence in Hamilton. And then, just to put the icing on the cake, there was a building. So what you see on the top there is Otis Fensom. They made elevators. They also made forklifts at one point. And this is the footprint. This is actually the Otis building, but you can see how well linked it is to various industrial forms of transportation. Below, you can see the Studebaker building on the same footprint. The building was originally built, the building that Studebaker would buy was originally built in 1941 to make Beaufort's anti-aircraft guns. For those curious, that's what a Beaufort anti-aircraft gun looks like. It was sold to Studebaker in 1947 for about $500,000. Looking at some of the sources available to me in this case, Stu Chapman's book, My Father the Car, he indicates that the auditor of the manufacturing of the Beaufort's guns later joined Studebaker, and through him, a reasonable price was arranged for purchasing the building. The building apparently cost over $2 million for the Canadian government to buy. Cost over $2 million for the Canadian government to build, and Studebaker bought it for about $500,000. And it was a big modern manufacturing concern, so it was a good purchase. Later on, it was bought back by Otis and then bought by Allen Candy and used until 1997. Unfortunately, most of the building was demolished in 2012, and you can see what remains of some of the administrative offices. There's also a road that was renamed to Studebaker Place. But unfortunately, while there is a little bit of surviving architectural evidence of Studebaker in Hamilton, most of it is unfortunately gone. And with that, I will hand it back over to Andy.
All right. Thank you very much, Richard. Let me get back to our regularly scheduled program already in progress. There we go. All right, picking up after World War II, Studebaker, as Richard mentioned, that Studebaker had now a new factory online to help with their most prosperous era. After the short run of 1946 Skyway Champions, we see here in this picture, Studebaker introduced all new styling after World War II, and they were the first company to do so. Everyone else in the industry pretty much dusted off what they were building during 1942 model year. Studebaker said, this isn't for us. We have a celebrity designer in Raymond Loewy, and we're going to go and bring out something brand new that will wow the public. And that's exactly what happened. The new styling was a huge hit, and those early years of were actually the Hamilton plant's highest production years ever. In fact, 1950 calendar year was the record-setting output for the Hamilton outlet. They were producing 15,000 cars and trucks. Now I'm leaving out 1965 and 1966. More on that in a minute. But this particular year, 1950, was also Studebaker's best ever, as they produced over 400,000 cars and trucks company-wide. Studebaker also did not waste any ink, or did not spare any ink, promoting their new Canadian facility and their company outlets. We see this nice little article here on the new Studebaker plant, sets stage for vast expansion in Canada. During the early 50s, Studebaker acquired even additional more land around Hamilton with looking forward to future expansion. Unfortunately, that never came to pass. Here we get a good look of the Canadian plant right here, and you can just see the Studebaker Corporation of Canada Limited. I was lucky enough to be up at the Canadian International Auto Show a number of years ago, and Stu Chapman, who Richard mentioned earlier, Stu is a life trustee at the Studebaker National Museum, and he graciously drove us around the former Canadian plant and gave us a very in-depth tour of what went on there. The first Studebaker to roll off the line is a 1948 champion, and I have to read the details here. Forget my reading glasses here. Gloria Rutkowski and Hilda Barker, they were the first two girls to be employed in Hamilton, and they actually do say girls in the photo caption here. Cutting the ribbon is Mr. Arthur Eggert. He was a 39-year Studebaker employee. DC Gaskin, who is actually seated in the passenger seat of the car, he's a vice president and general manager. And the driver is W.F. Jones of the International Garage in St. Catharines, Ontario. I'm guessing that was the dealership that this car was destined for. But, certainly an auspicious moment to cut the ribbon for the first Studebaker to come off the line. And I mentioned during this period, Studebaker was going great guns. They had introduced their all-new styling after World War II in 1947. They introduced a brand new truck line in 1949, the 2R series, and the Hamilton plant was producing all of these models during this period. We see the truck cabs on the same line as the automobile bodies. Studebaker was going strong. They had a lot to offer, and the buying public was certainly liking what they were seeing and flocking to Studebaker showrooms. The bullet nose models came out in 1951, and 1950, we see 51 models here. This was Studebaker's bestseller ever. They made over 500,000 bullet nose models in 1950 and 1951. It seems if anyone remembers a Studebaker, it's always the bullet nose models. It's the most popular car we have at the Studebaker National Museum. In fact, if for some reason we don't have a bullet nose model on the floor, it just sends a ripple throughout our visiting audience, just wondering what did we do with the bullet nose and when will it be back? When will it be back? The 50s were, I mentioned, the bestseller ever. In 1951, you started to see some restrictions from the Korean War, and unfortunately, despite the cars were actually very fine automobiles, they did not sell as well as the 50s, but are still highly collectible among Studebaker owners today. So how do you tell a Canadian built Studebaker during this period? Well, during the mid-50s, I believe it was I think it was either 52 or 53, they started putting this little maple leaf badge on the instrument panels, Studebaker, so that you would know for sure that you were driving a Canadian-built Studebaker. And also, as noted with some of the earlier models, there were some detailed differences at times, possibly some supplier differences. If you look in the parts catalog, sometimes you'll notice things are specified for Canadian production cars versus American production cars. But during the mid-50s, look for the maple leaf on the instrument panel. And that will tell you for sure that your car was built at the Hamilton, Ontario plant. Another way to tell is looking at the serial number plate. Alluded to that earlier. We see here the Studebaker Corporation made in Canada, Studebaker of Canada Limited. And we'll see what car this came off of a little bit later on in the presentation here. I mentioned the early 50s were Studebaker's greatest period of success. Unfortunately, as the decade went on, the buyer's market or the seller's market went away, the buyer's market came into focus, and Studebaker found itself really in a battle for its very existence. Key point that things were not the way they were right after the war was in 1954 when the Ford Motor Company and Chevrolet squared off in a sales war. Dealers were flooded with cars and told to take them, or else they were not going to be Ford or Chevrolet dealers next year. They were cutting prices, selling these cars as cheaply as possible. And while it was, certainly a great sales year for both Ford and Chevrolet, the rest of the industry was left holding the bag, and Studebaker in particular. production fell dramatically from 1953 to 1954, and no company was immune. Even Chrysler took a 25% hit from 1953 to 1954 as a direct result of the sales war. Studebaker countered as best they could. They merged with Packard in 1954. There was another management agreement with the Curtiss-Wright Corporation in 1956, which injected some cash into the company. The Lark in 1959 brought temporary salvation, but unfortunately in 1964, General Motors and Chrysler brought out their compact models, and Studebaker was once again going head-to-head with the big guys. The Avanti, as we see here in this slide, really Studebaker's last-ditch effort to really interest the buying public in what Studebaker was offering. Unfortunately, by this time, the Avanti could not and did not save Studebaker, and the company was not long for the automotive landscape. I realize this is the depressing part of the talk here, and just bear with me, but really the telling tale was from 1953 until 1963, Studebaker lost money every year except for one, and that was 1959, and that really tells you all you need to know right there about what they were facing as the decades turned into the 1960s. December 9th, 1963, the announcement came down, Studebaker was closing the South Bend plant. Production would continue in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Now, for many, certainly it was great for the Canadian plant, but in the big picture, Studebaker realized that they just did not have a long-term future in the industry. I hate to put it this way, but they were essentially playing out the string with the last few years at the Canada plant. They were not signing up any new dealers after 1964. They had contracts with dealers to supply automobiles. Had they just closed up at that time in 1963, there would have been tremendous liquidation costs, including settling those contracts with dealers. They were able to get it down to a more manageable setup as the calendar turned to 1965 and 1966. Just a tremendous hit for the city of South Bend. Studebaker had been part of the landscape since 1852, 111 years. But thankfully, Studebaker had the Canadian plant and a fine plant. Many have commented over the years that the Canadian outlet actually built a better car than the South Bend plant. And what Richard talked about, it was a brand new facility almost when Studebaker got it. Many of the facilities in South Bend were dated back to the horse-drawn era. And really, the Canadian plant was much more efficient than the Studebaker South Bend outlet, and there were even hopes that perhaps Studebaker could even turn a profit, as the break-even point was much lower and other efficiencies that could be realized. The Canadian plant, since it was now becoming Studebaker's primary production facility, it needed more workers, and we see this picture. I believe it's from early calendar year 1964, as the employment office was full of people coming down to fill out applications for works, as now they were going to have to go to a two-shift operation. We see here, this is actually loading the truck of the first shipment of Canadian-built Studebakers to the United States. And I love this shot, just you see the new 64 model going on with the Studebaker lettering in the background. Certainly the Canadian plant was doing their darndest to fulfill the needs and trying to do their best to keep Studebaker ongoing. As calendar turned to the 1965 model year, there were some changes with Studebaker's product. When the South Bend plant closed, that also went Studebaker's engine plant. Engines were sourced from GM, from the McKinnon Industries division. We see here, this is the first 65 Studebaker to come off the line. And we see Gordon Grundy, president of Studebaker of Canada, and Bill Moser, VP of Production, shaking hands as the first Canadian-built 65 model comes off the end of the assembly line. And now we're going to take a look at a film Studebaker put together, Accent on Quality. And this film, in its original length, runs about 15 minutes. We don't really have that much time tonight. I edited it down, so if you see some hasty cuts in there, that's entirely mine. That's not how Studebaker produced it. But let's take a look at Studebaker's Hamilton, Ontario facility with an introduction by Mr. Grundy here.
By consolidating our entire manufacturing and shipping facilities for world markets in one operation, we have effected great economies in production. The Canadian Hamilton plant occupies some 350,000 square feet under one roof with 10 acres of land for expansion purposes. Our two-shift workforce, consisting of over 1,100 employees, has been divided into small, personalized teams. As such, our people take a very personal pride in the quality and craftsmanship of their individual team's effort.
On the body assembly line, stress areas are heliarc welded. The rear fenders are bolted on, doors hung, and deck lid is carefully fitted. The hood is installed, then the assembled unit is carefully scrutinized under lights to bring out any defective spot. The completed body shell is now subjected to the Parker rust-proofing process, consisting of a detergent wash, which removes all surface impurities. Then a second treatment of phosphate and sodium nitrate solution is applied. The material is thoroughly dried in this 60-foot oven. After drying, the entire lower surface is coated with an underseal material. 2 heavy primer coats of zinc oxide surfacer are applied, inside and out, then baked. The primer coat is wet sanded by hand, and the sanding residue continuously flushed away to reveal to the operator a flawless painting surface. The high luster for which Studebaker finishes are noted starts with 2 heavy coats of sapphire luster enamel. These are baked on in infrared ovens at 280 degrees Fahrenheit. Each individual assembly, after painting, is inspected. Should even a pinhole be visible, the inspector will immediately return the component for touch-up. Here, the completed shell is dressed for society. Headlining is installed. Door glass installed. Then the rear window. Door trim is fitted. And the instrument panel is installed. Now it is complete and ready for the chassis. While the body is progressing through the many trim operations, these men have been preparing the chassis so that when the two come together, they are just as the customer ordered. Note the construction of the frame itself, with extra thick side rails and heavy cross members. This forms the foundation of Studebaker's rugged construction. To assure a level ride, Studebaker's engineers have designed an air-operated hydraulic compressor to preset the riding height of the springs. The steering knuckle and support is heavy, long-lasting. No fast-wearing ball joints are used here. Steering is effortless, thanks to recirculating ball steering. As the chassis nears completion, the engine and transmission assembly is made ready for positioning. The next step brings the body and frame together. The front end sheet metal and radiator assembly is added. Oversized low-profile tires are mounted on 15-inch wide base safety rim wheels installed on the hubs, and the car can move off the line under its own power. Now it is tested on the dynamometer under simulated road driving conditions. Headlights are adjusted. Wheel alignment completed. And final inspection operations carried out. Scratches are sprayed in if necessary, then baked. Now the entire car is tested for water leaks under a high-pressure spray. Every few minutes, another car is ready for release and shipment to dealer, where it receives its pre-delivery inspection.
now seen our Canadian plant in operation and have been able to observe for yourself how we build quality into our cars.
Yeah, I'll say that's certainly impressive watching everything that went in there. I'd like to have a word with the guy who water tested my 64 Daytona, because I'm convinced that it was never done, judging by how much water comes into that car, but it was built in South Bend, so what can you say? Moving forward, Studebaker didn't do any styling changes from 1964 to 1965. They marketed those models as the common sense car, that no annual model changes to make the car obsolete. They realized that maybe this was not the best way to approach it, because in 1966, they had made some upgrades to the new styling. We see here some very attractive updates. Studebaker had to farm out their styling and many of their engineering services as well too here. I believe it was Hazelquist, Marks and Powers handled the styling updates for 1966. And I always thought they did a wonderful job of really making the car look fresh and new without changing that much. One area they did concentrate on was they tried to give all 66 Studebakers a much more luxurious interior, and they used very high-end interior fabrics, as they felt that was one way they could create the most perceived value for what amounted to a fairly minimal investment. Unfortunately, Studebaker decided they were not going to continue in the automobile business after 1966 model year. March 4th, 1966, the announcement came down that the Studebaker was ceasing production, even at the Hamilton, Ontario plant as well. The final Studebaker came off the line in Hamilton, St. Patrick's Day, 1966 at 8:11 in the morning. We see it here, the final car, 1966 Cruiser, finished in Timberline turquoise with power steering, disc brakes, and the white vinyl top. This particular automobile has a number of unique features to it, aside from the equipment I just mentioned. With it coming down as the last car on the assembly line, a number of workers took the time to actually personalize the vehicle. There's a gentleman's name scratched into the top of the cowl on the passenger side. Underneath the instrument panel, written on the support in grease pencil, this is for the last Studebaker. And I believe I even noticed someone's initials look like they took a punch and pounded them into the bottom of the front suspension plate, that's a lot of work, because that's a pretty hefty piece of metal there. We even found out that the workers left something in the car as well. When this car received a cosmetic restoration by the museum's volunteer crew back in the early 2000s, and it was up at a show, I believe it was near the Hamilton plant, but one of the Canadian Studebaker clubs had it up for a show, and a gentleman came by and said, I was on the line that day and I put a Union newspaper in the door panel. And sure enough, they popped off the door panel and there was the newspaper. Car here we see that's unfortunately the end of 114 years of Studebaker vehicle manufacturing. But that's a good run for many companies. They would never even come close to celebrating that number of years, and Studebaker was able to do that through the transition, the demise of their original market, the horse-drawn vehicle, and all the obstacles they faced, and really a testament to the dedication and the hard work of all the folks associated with Studebaker. I was doing some back of the napkin math here. If you look at Studebaker's year producing cars in Canada, between the two plants, that come with 45 years between the Hamilton and the Walkerville plants. If you look at it in the Indiana and South Bend, Studebaker was producing cars, we count wartime production, for 47 years. Just thought of an interesting statistic. I'll finish off with some numbers. I always love doing the little trivia bit here before we open it up for questions. The most successful Studebaker model in terms of production, talking the Walkerville years, was actually the 1916 four-cylinder model, the SF4. Studebaker produced over 6,000 of those that year at the Walkerville plant. If we go forward to the Hamilton years, the most popular model was the 1950 Champion. They produced 12,136 of those in 1950 out of Hamilton. So we mentioned 1950 was the best calendar year production for cars and trucks at Hamilton, with 15,296. And if we go back to Walkerville, we'll finish there. The best model year production for there was back, I just had it here. Oh, it was indeed 1919, I believe. There. Yes, it was. 1919, where they produced just over 5,000 automobiles. Again, that's at Walkerville. We'll conclude there with my portion of the talk. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. And with that, turn it back to the guys.
Oh, well, thanks, Andy and Rich.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, let's see what our audience has or would like to know. Starting us off, Roderick, who is the proud owner of a Hamilton-built 63 Lark Daytona Wagonaire, would like to know if Studebaker ever exported any of their 2 or 4 door sedans from South Bend to kind of ease off on their excess stock problems.
Probably they would. I mean, if there was a way they could get cars, to the customer, I'm sure they were more than happy to do it, especially at that time. We do show, we have most of the production records for South Bend and the early Canada years, and some of those we will see destinations for some Canadian destinations for South Bend built cars. But by and large, I think more importantly, they were trying to source as much out of Canada for the obvious financial advantages as they could for the Canadian markets.
Now, Rich, question for you, and I'm gonna extemporize a bit on Will's question because I think he's going in some interesting directions. He's talking about how people like the mayor of Hamilton had a personal Studebaker. How much did these cars show up in city history as being sort of the signature car of Hamilton while the plant was at its peak? Oh, you're muted though.
Thank you. My computer just told me that. I don't know at its peak, but certainly there are very active clubs and many dedicated owners of Studebakers in Hamilton, and they do show up a fair amount. I do know that the police did actually buy Studebakers from the Studebaker Hamilton in order to sort of keep the production and to sort of for the city to contribute to this in order for Studebaker to keep going. So they did in fact buy police cars, which is why they were available to be restored.
David would like to know, are there any sort of, for either of you, sort of Studebaker celebrity advertising? Because I know the 50s and 60s were sort of the big era of get random celebrities to endorse their cars. Who was associated with Studebakers?
Well, Studebaker actually sponsored the Mr. Ed television show from 1961 to 1963. So if you consider a talking horses celebrity, they had Mr. Ed as well as Alan Young and Connie Hines doing Studebaker commercials. Zsa Zsa Gabor did a couple of Studebaker commercials as well. Paul Ford, another, you may not recognize the name immediately, but as soon as you see him, you'll go, oh, that guy. And in fact, a very young Mike Wallace actually was a spokesperson for Studebaker in a promotional, like a sales film from 1950. So they had their share.
Hank's curious about, apparently there's some shared history between Studebaker and Volkswagen.
Mm-hmm.
Can you speak to that at all?
Well, I do know that Studebaker, like everyone else in the industry after World War II, looked at Volkswagen as, is this something they wanted to take on? And Studebaker passed, as Ford did too. So it's hard to criticize them for that. But I do know after Studebaker of Canada, Gordon Grundy managed an arrangement where Studebaker acted as the importer for Volkswagen for I believe I don't know if it was the end of the 64 model year and the 65 model year, but it netted them a fairly decent amount. I think it was like $100 some a car, to the point where then Studebaker even investigated, okay, maybe this is something we could do for other companies. And they investigated looking at Toyota and Datsun. Unfortunately, they could never put those deals together. And Richard, I don't know if you had more to add to that, but feel free.
Not really. I mean, I doing my research, I did discover the link with Studebaker and Volkswagen, and yes, primarily an importer of cars.
We've had a couple questions about sort of both the design popularity. You called it, Andy, in our practice session. Andy said somebody's going to ask about the bullet nose, but sort of a couple of people, both Jessica and Edgar, are kind of asking what really made Studebakers stand out and led to them being so popular, whether that be, you know, the bullet nose design or something else in the 50s and 60s.
Well, that's just it. You could always, by and large, Studebaker was most successful when they went with an original design, something not shared with the rest of the industry. And during their best years, you could count on something different being in Studebaker showrooms, from the 47 models, which were, you know, all new styling, lower. They just looked modern. The bullet nose was just outlandish. You know, it's hard to believe that, you know, they would stick a big propeller on the front of the car and that sold in the numbers they did, but people loved them. And the 53 Starliner, which looked nothing like anything else in the industry at the time. I mean, the US auto industry's design theme at that time was pretty much perpendicular. And here's Studebaker with this low slung, you know, European streamlined product. And they went back to that recipe with the Avanti in the early 60s. So, you know, is good. Raymond Loewy Associates knew how to design a pretty attractive car, and Studebaker, despite being a pretty conservative company by many measures, they weren't afraid to take the plunge with trying something new and bold.
A question for sort of both of you, both Janice and Craig are wondering if there are any Studebaker archives or publicly accessible places where they could go look at, for instance, that factory film clip we just saw, whether in Hamilton or elsewhere. Especially, I think, on this side of the border would be the obvious question.
Mm-hmm.
Some of these, of course, the Studebaker National Museum archives, I'm the archivist, we have those videos available. Actually, we sell them through the museum store. We do have some clips of those through our YouTube channel. If you go to YouTube and look for Studebaker National Museum, we have some of those up there where you can take a look at. Richard, I don't know if you have any resources in your neighborhood up there that might be closer for folks.
There are a couple of scrapbooks of primarily of newspaper articles over the years that Studebaker was in Hamilton at the local history and archives at the Hamilton Central Library. If you wanted to read newspapers from the time commenting on the various activities of Studebaker and how the company was doing. There's also a heritage plaque located at the former site of the factory in Hamilton to give a little bit of background on the site and the history of Studebaker. But I mean, other than that, most of the heritage that has been done by individuals, and it's sort of out there on the web through Google. You can discover a number of things that people have found and written about in the past, but there's no sort of central repository other than the limited amount of things that are at the Central Library.
Umair wants to know, and this is I'm intrigued at the idea of this question. Given that we've seen stuff like DeLorean's re-enter limited production, is there any hope of somebody getting the rights to build new Studebakers anytime soon?
Well, I'd say never, but the sheer cost of starting any type of automobile enterprise where you're building an automobile, there's billions with a B that starts right there, but you never know. Retro always seems to be in the industry. I mean, you look at the Dodge Challenger that's been in production from the updated version for close to a dozen years now, if not more. And I always sit there and think, gosh, wouldn't it be great if someone could do something like that with the Studebaker? And to a certain degree, the Avanti was kind of that story where it outlived Studebaker, and you could still buy an updated version of the Avanti as late as about 2009, 2010.
Well, so I see we're right at 8 o'clock here, but there's still quite a long Q&A. This is a really popular Q&A. So, Demeric, maybe we want to just take maybe 2 more questions, and then we can wrap up for the evening.
Alan's curious to know if you can verify a rumor that the 66 production stopped when it did because of a single cracked die in the plant, and they could no longer build trunk lids for the sedans, apparently. I
was wondering if the trunk lid question was going to come up. I've heard that story too. Can I confirm it? No. Can I say it didn't happen? No, but I do know trunklets have been in short supply for those models for a lot of years, whether it was, a production problem with that or what. But yeah, I've heard that too. And yeah, I can't answer it positively or negatively one way or the other.
And then I guess quickly to close us off, Bill wants to know if there's sort of one big takeaway for what led to Studebaker failing. What was the main cause for the demise of what was obviously for a time a fairly flourishing company?
Oh boy, you said, well, we can be done by 9 if we tackle that question, but the long and the short of it is Studebaker just could not compete in the most competitive business, industry at that time, the automotive business. Studebaker was the 66th largest company in the at that time, but 3 of the top 5 are Ford, GM, and Chrysler. So it's just, if I'm in a poker game with, Mark Cuban, Elon Musk, and some other incredibly rich person besides them, I might win a few hands, but their pot's a whole lot bigger than mine, and eventually the odds are going to catch up to you. Studebaker needed to make the right decision every time for them to succeed, and that's just simply not possible. It's a wonder that they lasted as long as they did. We're talking 114 years in business and the adversity they faced, but they went down swinging. They were not, they didn't just throw up their hands when the market changed in the early 50s and go, well, we're flummoxed, what are we going to do? No, they tried everything they could, and that produced some of the most memorable products of the auto industry. So for that, we are thankful, but it's a tale told in many industries over the years where, the venerable longtime company just, is unable to compete any longer.
Great. Well, thank you, gentlemen, so much. We still have quite a few questions, but Dumeric will send those out. And if you want to, we can connect with the people that have asked them after the talk, of course. There were several questions about the Auto Pact and its relationship to Studebaker. And I know that Dimitri Anastakis is actually on this call right now. And he will be speaking in November on the impact of the Canadian Auto Pact. And I will personally remind him that people have a lot of questions about Studebaker and how they were impacted by that. But so you're gonna have to save those questions for later this year. So we'll get a Canadian perspective on the Auto Pact. And obviously that would happen in 1965. So right here at the end of Studebaker. So more to come. You have to check out all the talks for this to all come together and to be a real Canadian automotive expert. I know it's fun after a few years that a lot of these talks start to dovetail together. And I'm sure at some point we'll get someone talking about Volkswagen, and we'll ask the Studebaker again to a Volkswagen expert and see what they have to say about it as well. So thank you, gentlemen, for joining us this evening. And we will be in touch because Studebaker is a great part of the Canadian automotive story. And by our turnout tonight, we can see it's very popular with our audience. So hopefully we'll be able to connect on future projects as we continue to study the impact of the auto here in Canada. So any last words before I let you go for the evening?
I just remembered this. I wanted to give a shout out to, I don't know if Tom Pride is on is still hanging in with the broadcast here, but I got a note. Yeah, I got a note earlier that actually his father was one of the longest tenured employees at Studebaker of Canada, and just wanted to give him a shout out there. But yeah, thanks very much for having me. This was a blast.
Very cool.
Thank you very much for having me too, and allowing me to talk and also to learn something, because it was fascinating what is known about Studebaker and the history of this company.
Yeah, great. So thanks again, and have a good evening, and we'll see you all back on March 16th at 12 p.m. And we're going to talk about Canadian dirt bikes. So hope you can join us then.